and welcome to this episode of the Neurology Lounge podcast. In this episode, I will be speaking to Daniel Gibbs, author of A Tattoo on My Brain, a neurologist's personal battle against Alzheimer's disease. We will be discussing his perspective of Alzheimer's as a neurologist who has been diagnosed with the disease. Daniel Gibbs is a retired general neurologist in Portland, Oregon, and he has sadly been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease. His background is that he received his MD and PhD degrees from Emory University and did his medicine internship, a research fellowship, and a faculty appointment in neuroendocrinology at UCSD. He then completed neurology training at Oregon Health and Science University in 1989. He has spent about 24 years caring for patients with dementia, many of them with dementia, and he's now an advocate for the early recognition and management of Alzheimer's disease. He has written about his experiences from 2 points of view, doctor and patient, in A Tattoo on My Brain, and this was published in 2021 by Cambridge University Press and revised in 2023. His next book, Dispatches from the Land of Alzheimer's, is due to be released in April 2024. Daniel Gibbs, welcome to the Neurology Lounge podcast, and I'm very grateful that you accepted my invitation. I'm quite pleased with this.
Well, I'm honored. Thank you for having me.
Okay. My first question is kind of formulaic, and it's, why did you write the book?
Well, it just struck me at some point that I had a potentially interesting perspective on the disease, since I had been treating patients with dementias for my whole career. And all of a sudden here, I had it. I had written many medical papers and scientific papers in my career, 30-some. And I realized very quickly that this was a totally different task to take on the writing for a book. And I actually got as far as a 60-page, what's the word?
Is it
well, I'm blocking on the word.
Monograph, I suppose.
Monograph, yeah.
Okay.
And an agent in New York looked at it and said, this will never sell. And she says that there's nothing about your feelings in it. And I said, what feelings? and I realized then that I was going to have some help.
Okay.
And I actually got connected with Teresa Barker, who was my co-writer, and she was wonderful. She would say, when I was talking about stuff, she would give me almost daily writing assignments, and then when I turned them in, she would say, "But Dan, how did that make you feel?" And that was totally foreign to the way I had written in the past, where it had been very analytical, but she changed my ability to write in a way that was accessible to a general audience.
Did she therefore change part of the reason for writing, kind of transmitting the emotional impact of?
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, because that was what she was interested in hearing from me.
Okay.
And whereas I had kind of blocked all of that out in my own writing, okay. I was just talking about the science.
Yeah. And most people want to know about feelings.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you've actually answered my second question, which was how you did go about writing it. One of the reasons you stated for writing the book was to convey, I'm quoting you, a practical and helpful understanding of the disease from the inside out. How did being a neurologist and a scientist help you to do that?
Well, again, that it was not my total. I was a general neurologist, so I took all things from carpal tunnels to migraines to strokes. I had a lot of MS patients, and I had quite a few dementia patients. But back in the late 80s and 90s, when I was getting started, there was nothing we could really do for our dementia patients. And I have to say that it was my least favorite diagnosis to deal with.
I can imagine.
And I'm embarrassed to say that the way that I handled it, and I think probably most neurologists at the time, was denial and and to support denial and saying, well, this probably isn't Alzheimer's. Let's just take another look at you in a year or so and see how you're doing. And that wasn't helpful. But that was the standard of care back in the early 90s until the cholinesterase inhibitors came out, Aricept and that family. And then there was actually something you could do for it. And for me, it all changed there.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. One of the key messages I got from your book was the importance of making use of the time left with Alzheimer's disease, which is one of the key messages I thought you were trying to transmit. You argued that there was potentially the years, even decades of meaningful time that can be maximized. And you have encouraged people with Alzheimer's to take the opportunity to, what you said, get serious about making the most of the time you have. How practical is that, being that people with Alzheimer's are already burdened by this psychological weight of the disease? How do they kind of get over that and enjoy that time?
Okay, well, one of my missions in life is to try to help people understand the difference between Alzheimer's disease and Alzheimer's dementia.
Okay.
And as you know, I'm sure the pathology in the brain starts to occur up to 20 years before there are any cognitive effects known. And there's more and more attention being paid to what can we do in the pre-symptomatic stage to slow the progression of the disease and perhaps even cure it someday. I'm not a pessimist at all. I'm an optimist, but I don't think we're going to find a quote unquote cure for Alzheimer's disease, once it's already in dementia, at least not for a long time. And I think the thought needs to be switched to what can I do to slow the progression of my asymptomatic Alzheimer's disease? Well, how do you know you have asymptomatic Alzheimer's disease? Well, that doesn't necessarily mean everyone has to go out and get a blood test or a genetic test or anything like that. The first thing to ask is, does anyone in my family have it? Because a family history of Alzheimer's is the #1 risk factor for getting it later in life. So I encourage people who have a family history of Alzheimer's disease at this point to volunteer for research projects, because there's a real need for research subjects who don't have any symptoms of dementia or cognitive impairment, but yet have abnormal pathology in their brain. And as you might imagine, those people are hard to find because they don't know it themselves. But the clue is, do they have a family history? And having a family history doesn't mean you're going to get it, but it certainly increases your chances. I'm probably wandered totally off topic from where we started there.
No, that's exactly where we are. I think the question has always been, I think, as neurologists, where we make a lot of diagnoses where there are no treatments. And the question is it fair to make a diagnosis when you really can't make a difference to that person? But clearly from your book, which we'll discuss later, there's quite a lot apart from a cure.
Yeah.
A lot more that can be done. And that actually leads me to the next question, which was your advice to the medical profession to shift focus away from this, you said, assumptions of helplessness and despair, and to look at the earlier stages of disease where we can overturn the gloomy attitude. Do you think neurologists are part of the problem in managing this condition where, as you mentioned, there's a lot of denial on the part of physicians to avoid making the diagnosis? Are we part of the problem in getting in there early enough to intervene?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think we're going to have to educate a new generation of neurologists with a different mindset to approaching dementia.
Yeah.
And I don't know what that's going to look like. It's a multifaceted problem. Right now in the U.S., I don't know how it is in the U.K., but the system is being overwhelmed by people trying to get lecanemab, and people can't get an appointment for a neurological assessment for over a year.
Yeah.
Is lecanemab available in the UK yet?
I'm not quite sure at the moment myself. I mean,
Okay.
there's been a big debate and
Yeah.
whether or not to use this
Yeah.
antibodies, whether they're making a big deal, whether they make much of a difference.
Absolutely.
I think if there is
But
at all, it will be limited use. Yeah.
right, but that's giving us a view of what how the system is going to be really strained by trying to do some things that may not be that helpful. And I don't know, I'm again losing the track of where we started on this, but what was the question again? And
We are on track. It's whether we neurologists aren't doing enough to get in early enough. And your case is...
let me say this. My goal personally is to do everything I can to slow the progression of my disease,
Yeah.
so that I have more years, as many years as possible of a reasonably good life,
Yes.
which it still is. It's a very good life, and that I die of something else before I die of Alzheimer's. And that may sound appalling to people, but as you know, Alzheimer's is not a good way to go, and trying to push that off into the future is my goal.
And it is a disease that I think a lot of the population of the world is really scared of. It's losing cognition. And going back to when your symptoms started, it's interesting that it came on very gradually, and you put it in quite interesting way. You said it of how it staked out its slowly growing presence in your brain. Is this the reason why the early stage is so difficult to establish? It kind of just creeps in gradually, and you're not really quite sure what's going on.
No, absolutely. My first symptom was probably my anosmia, which at the time I really didn't know that was an issue with Alzheimer's disease. I knew, we basic in our training was that in Parkinson's disease, 80% of people get anosmia at some point. But there was nothing, I was never taught that, people with Alzheimer's get anosmia. Turns out that when tested, virtually 100% of people with Alzheimer's do have impairment of olfaction, but most of them are not aware of it because it came on slowly. In my case, it was what brought it to my attention was that I had these phantosmias, these stereotypical smells that are actually, I think, pretty rare. They happen in Parkinson's disease, but not. I've heard from a number of people with Alzheimer's who say, yes, I get those, but it's not in the literature at all of being something, a sign of Alzheimer's. It's not really. So I really wasn't even thinking about the possibility of dementia until I accidentally found out I was an ApoE4 homozygote. And having two copies of the ApoE4 allele made it almost certain that I would have Alzheimer's dementia by age 80 and about a 50% chance by age 70. So that's got my attention.
Much further down the road from impairment of sense of the smell, actually. I was quite impressed. I like the way you described the phantosmia. You said intrusive smells that didn't seem to have any origin in the real world, as though the brain is inventing a smell to replace the one it can no longer detect. So the loss of smell was going along with this fictitious smell, isn't it?
And interestingly, the phantosmias continued for a few years after I was totally anosmic.
Okay.
So yeah, but they became less and less frequent, and and changed in quality just a little bit. But I haven't had one for years now.
So that's settled down now. It's
Yeah. It was not unpleasant at all. I mean, in the literature, if you look up phantosmias, they're usually described as being foul and unpleasant odors. And most of that, most of the work that I found that had been done on phantosmias was from the ENT side of it. And I don't know, neurologists weren't seeing people for that problem.
Okay. And I don't
Or at
think
least
we're very good at
they weren't publishing on it. Yeah.
and we're not very good at testing for this sense of smell in the clinic as well, I suppose.
Yeah.
That's another interesting thing was, I mean, it was 8 years after you developed the sense of smell problems that you first noticed the cognitive problems. You said you first noted trouble recalling names and occasional words, and then word finding pauses, incidents of absent-mindedness. How does someone in these early stages, in the first few years, distinguish these from kind of senescent forgetfulness, benign forgetfulness in old age? When should one be concerned?
Yeah.
This is more than just, yeah.
Well, that's a very good question, and obviously everyone with age, by middle age, is starting to have some cognitive issues to some degree. People have come up with recommendations about what's normal aging, loss of olfaction, and what should get your attention. And I can't remember exactly all the list is, but it's common things like misplacing things are not something you need to worry about. But just totally blacking out on an event or something is something that might be of concern.
And then, subsequently, then it became clear you lost your ability to plan and multitask. And then you said you slipped further into the fog of Alzheimer's. And that was the time you decided to retire as a physician. You said there was no room for memory lapses or errors of judgment in medicine. If you had been in a different profession, do you think you could have carried on working? Is it just?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. But just, in medicine, you can't afford to make a mistake by forgetting something about a patient or whatever. And that was what urged me to retire early. I still was able to teach. So my neurological fund of knowledge was still maybe not perfect, but it was certainly enough to teach. And I continued to work with medical students here and also in Africa. For beginning in the early, when was that? 2005 or something like that. I started making yearly trips to Tanzania to teach in neurology in a medical school and to see patients there. And I continued to do that for a few years after retiring. But interestingly, the thing that interfered with my doing even that was my loss after a few years of being able to understand language. And if in the hospital that I was working at, we had morning report in this cement-walled room where everything echoed. The teaching was all done in English, but the accents were heavy. And I found that after a year or two of after I retired, I just couldn't understand the morning report at all. And it was kind of a little bit frightening. And I could understand one-on-one with people, but the cacophony of multiple sounds was hard. And that's an issue that becomes more and more apparent as dementia progresses, particularly Alzheimer's, is that for most of us, verbal memory is the one that's affected the most. So our ability to remember words, and that now is just bad. I mean, really, really bad. I can't remember the name of drugs anymore, or even the drugs that I'm taking. So well, I'm totally lost on where we started that. But
you're exactly on track. You're exactly on track. And just a curious thing you mentioned, does the receptive bit of language go earlier than the expressive element of it? You talked about.
Well, for me, it did, and I think that's more the case. I do have right now. I have a lot of trouble coming up with the right words, and I think that's a little bit of both of receptive and expressive.
Well, I have to say there hasn't been much evidence of it today, so that's very good. And that still on this aspect of language, I think it takes me to the next question, which is in painting the picture of your memory impairment, you used quite a lot of memorable metaphors.
I should say in advance, these are probably Teresa's metaphors.
Okay, well, they're quite good. You say you referred to how the disease gums up the works and destroys the compass and coordinates of memory, eventually leaving the mind adrift at sea. So, well, you kind of said it might be Teresa's work, but did you yourself find the metaphors as good in expressing what Alzheimer's does to the brain? Did you find that?
Yeah, no, it did. And in fact, have you had a chance to look at the new book?
No, I haven't actually, because
okay.
At the moment I'm outside the UK, so I haven't been collected. But I will get it and have a look.
Yeah, because a number of the essays in there are on this topic. There's one called the Fog of Alzheimer's, and I've got a picture I took years ago while sailing of this sailboat sitting in the fog with the masts coming up out of the fog bank in it. But that essay is addressed at this very thing of the fog and how it comes and goes on top of the baseline of cognitive decline. And the last essay of that book is the one I liked the best. And it's let me see. I can't remember the name of it now. Living in the Moment with Alzheimer's.
Okay.
And that's about the
yeah.
It's only a page. Do you want me to read it to you?
Yes, please. I'm going to get the book in a couple of weeks, but my curiosity has already been piqued.
Yeah. And here's the picture that goes with it of me teaching my daughter how to sail in the 1990s. Okay. When we are young, the timeline of our lives stretches from our earliest memories to our expectations for the future. As the cognitive impairment of Alzheimer's disease progresses, that timeline begins to constrict. Perhaps surprisingly, the first memories that start to go are the most recent. Where did I put that? You fill in the blank. The consolidation of new memories in the hippocampus is impaired, while our ability to remember events from the distant past is relatively well preserved in a variety of cortical regions of the brain. As time goes on and the amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles spread throughout the brain, the distant memories start to fade. The memories most likely to endure are those that are associated with strong emotional content, but eventually even those start to disappear. At the same time, our abilities to look into the future and make plans become impaired as damage spreads to the prefrontal cortex. Eventually, in the late stages of Alzheimer's, we're left with life in the present, no past and no future. I'm not there yet, but I can sense the shrinking timeline of memories from the past and plans for the future. For those of us on the Alzheimer's journey, it is really important to embrace the moment and not dwell on the frustration of trying to remember the past and plan for the future. Others can help us retrieve old memories. Calendars, lists, and Post-it notes will help us minimize the chaos of the future. But happiness and peace come from focusing on the moment, whether it is hugging a grandchild, writing in a journal, working in the garden, or listening to great music. It has, as Horace put it over 2,000 years ago, seize the day and don't worry about tomorrow. So,
very, very touching. And that applies to everyone with or without Alzheimer's, really.
of course.
Nobody knows what the next moment is going to be. And just maybe a bit off track. You mentioned the aspect of appreciating music. Apparently, that seems to remain for long after the other cognitive deficits and Alzheimer's. I wonder what the science is behind that.
Well, actually, I've got an essay about that as well in the new book.
Okay.
And the people who study this opine that it's because music is handled in so many parts of the brain, and a lot of it is in the deeper brain, where the procedural memory is. And I have on my blog, I have a video of this professional pianist, and there are lots of things out there like this, who has very advanced Alzheimer's disease, can't speak anymore, but she can still play beautifully on the piano. It's really remarkable to watch.
It's interesting. Just shows how complex the brain is.
Yeah.
Okay, and clearly the cognitive deficits of Alzheimer's kind of what everybody knows about, but your book actually brought out the fact that there's a lot more going on. You talked about problems with impaired proprioception, apathy, inability to recognize faces. Do you think the medical world is kind of overemphasizes the memory difficulties and doesn't put as much emphasis on these other things that are probably as disruptive as forgetfulness?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the verbal memory is the one that starts the earliest and gets people's attention, and a lot of these other things are more subtle. But they certainly, the various areas of the brain that are damaged work together, if you will, to make a firestorm. And it's different in different people. But in general, I'm kind of impressed by the role of the prefrontal cortex, or at least the presumptive role, as it is damaged in being one of the causes of apathy and the inability to make plans that is so characteristic of Alzheimer's disease. And one of the problems, it creates the apathy, it creates one of the difficulties, and that's maintaining social relationships. And as you know, I'm preaching to the choir, but the things that people could do with lifestyle changes that are all evidence-based include, number one, exercise, number two, diet, and then we start to get to things like increasing social engagement or maintaining social engagement and intellectual engagement, and then getting more than 7 hours of sleep, and then finally good control of cardiovascular risk factors, because they're all the same risk factors.
This brings us back to aducanumab, which you mentioned earlier on, and this was part of your narrative, was your participation in this drug trial. And then you sustained this adverse effect known as amyloid-related imaging abnormalities, or ARIA. And you said yours was the worst case reported in the literature.
At that time.
At that time, okay. Exactly.
Yeah, because there have been several deaths, since then that have been reported.
Okay, and that's the residual hemosiderin deposit is what has remained on your brain as a tattoo. Do you regret taking part in the trial?
Oh, no, not at all. Okay. I've been part of, I think, 8 trials, and I kind of lose track. And my intention in being in a research trial is not that I will benefit from that. It is that I'm helping to move the knowledge base further forward. And I try to make that point when I'm talking to people about, should I join a trial? And I said, well, I would urge you to do that, but do it for the right reasons. Because if you do it thinking that you're going to benefit from it, you'll probably be you're very likely to be disappointed.
That's a good point.
But if you approach it with the idea of, I'm doing my part to build the pyramid, as I say, where we put one block of knowledge on top of what's gone before.
Okay, it's a very altruistic way, which in a way it's also the only practical way, isn't it?
Yeah.
There's no other way. Okay. And even though you've talked about the fact that there's no cure, you still had this hope, which you said of some medication that might mitigate the neurodegenerative decline. Beyond the monoclonal antibodies, which I think at the moment there hasn't really been any that has risen to a very satisfactory level. Is there anything that gives you hope that there will be a cure soon? What kind of time frame? 5 years, 10 years?
Yeah,
Much further down.
I don't think there's anything. I don't think the cure is over the immediate horizon. But I do think that we'll, at least I hope, my fingers are crossed, that we'll find something, whether it's a medication or some device or whatever, that slows progression of the disease. And so that I'm a little bit upset, or I've changed my mind about the slogan for the Alzheimer's Association here is everything for getting a cure for Alzheimer's, and I think that's a mistake. You're going to fail.
Yeah.
If you're looking for a cure by this date or that date or whatever.
Yeah.
But if you can get something that slows progression, and there are lots of things that might. Inflammatory processes seem to be involved. There's lots of different things other than amyloid. I initially thought that we might have success in drugs against tau, but they've all failed. All the monoclonal antibody studies directed at tau have been unequivocally negative. So we need to move on, and the anti-amyloid ones are a teaser, but I'm particularly uneasy about I shouldn't say uneasy. Donanemab is far and away the most successful monoclonal antibody directed at amyloid. It totally removes it from the brain, and they actually can stop giving the drug in trials. And it's not clear yet when it'll come back. But it's still no cure. I mean, here's a drug that totally removes amyloid from the brain, and there's maybe a 35% slowing of progression, which may not even be clinically relevant, and noticeable to families. So it's a hint, but there are many things there are drugs that are being used for other things that are undergoing trials now that may have a bit of a hope. But I think the Alzheimer's pathology has to be just so complex and must involve interactions that are going to resist a Band-Aid. You look at all the success they've had with developing drugs against cancer, various cancer, actually curing it in many examples. And we're just something about Alzheimer's is just much more complicated than that. And I'm optimistic that we're going to get tools to use, but I don't think we should hold out the only success as being a cure, because that will be unrealistic.
And there's a big debate as to how much of the disease is caused by amyloid, and some people
That's right.
think it might actually be protective, but that's a different
Absolutely.
discussion, I suppose. But emphasis, of course, from your book was the protective effects you've mentioned already: diet, physical and mental exercise, social engagement, good sleep. And you said these can tweak the imprecise timeline of the disease in somebody's favor. Are these evidence-based, or are they kind of
Oh, yeah.
common sense?
The exercise is best. I mean, virtually all studies have shown benefit in aerobic exercise in slowing the progression of the disease or reducing the chance of getting it. But not in the end stages or the late stages.
Really?
And there have been good trials that have been done, I think, in Scotland, where it was a prospective trial, obviously not blinded, but the elderly people in these nursing homes were either given a rather rigorous exercise regimen or not. And actually, the people who had in this particular study, the people who had the rigorous exercise did less well, and because they had injuries, they had falls and things like that. Yeah. So, but in the earlier stages of dementia and in the pre-dementia exercise, there's no doubt. And then the Mediterranean style diet has very good evidence of that. So those two are perhaps the most unequivocally, or people are not arguing about that too much. Just a question of degree, how helpful they are. And sleep is becoming a much more interesting thing now that they've discovered this lymphatic circulation within the brain that helps. The idea is that it helps cleanse the brain at night, and that's still got a ways to go, but that's an interesting thing. And it looks like people who regularly get less than 7 hours of sleep a night, which is a lot of people in middle age, may have an increased risk.
Yeah, the lymphatic system. I know there was a trial in rats that it clears amyloid.
Yeah, it does.
Sleep. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay. I mean, the other thing which is obvious, how long have you been diagnosed now? How long have you had the diagnosis?
2015 was it, and that was based on PET scans. So I was in a trial at that point. No, I was in not in a drug trial, but I was in a neuroimaging trial.
Okay.
So I have to mention that I'm a very privileged person to be able to have access to all the stuff that is not generally accessible. I've had many PET scans because I've been parts of studies about them, and I've been able to see. I have friends who are experts in Alzheimer's, and so I haven't. I can call people up on the phone.
Okay.
I don't have to wait a year to get an appointment with a neurologist. I don't abuse that, but so I'm conscious of my privilege, and that I can't really serve as a model, but where was I going? Oh, but so back in 2015, I joined that neuroimaging trial at UCSF, University of California, San Francisco, and for that I had 2 days of cognitive tests, so really extensive cognitive testing. A 3 Tesla MRI scan, and I had 3 PET scans for that year. I had amyloid, tau, and the old one,
FDG.
FDG, right, which they don't use anymore or much. And I only had that one. And then 2 years later, I had the same thing, and 3 years later. So it's really interesting to be able to watch the progression in my brain. Oh, and the other interesting thing was that when we gathered to look at the results of I was there for a week having all these studies. And so going over those scans with people in the research group, I immediately saw on the PET scan that there was increased amyloid in olfactory areas, the prefrontal, or the orbital frontal cortex, and in the piriform cortex, which are both areas involved with higher processing of olfaction. And so I thought that was pretty interesting. And so that's then again part of the privilege I have is being able to have this way of defense mechanism of seeing my disease as a fascinating problem rather than something frightening.
Okay. So that was
I can't tell people to model that, but it's just it's a personal thing that I have that I'm very grateful for.
Is it a kind of a distraction technique? It's a psychological distraction. It takes you away from the I think nothing wrong with that. I mean, you've obviously done very well. And I think one of the things that people talk about as kind of preventing or slowing down the progression of memory difficulties is this cognitive reserve. How much do you think that has been in your favor? Clearly,
I think tremendously. You know, the cognitive reserve still is somewhat controversial, but the idea, as you know, is that people who have more education, a variety of things that have allowed them to build cognitive reserve, probably more synapses in the brain. There's a really interesting book, a study, but I totally missed the study. It was done in the 90s, called the Nun Study. I don't know if you know about that.
I think Time Magazine or one of those magazines highlighted it.
Yeah, but David Snowden was the guy who did it, I think, and he wrote a book, at least one book about it, where they followed these nuns in, I can't remember what country it was. I think it might have been in the UK.
Okay, I would definitely check it out.
Yeah, and when they entered the convent as teenagers or in their 20s, everybody had cognitive testing done. They weren't thinking about cognitive testing, but they had to write samples, things like that. And so they were able to follow these people to the end of their life and autopsy their brains because they had all volunteered to be part of the study. And this was the study that really first gave the idea of the cognitive reserve context, because the people who were quite literate at the beginning tended to have slower progression of their disease.
Okay.
And actually had, as I recall, don't quote, read the book, but I think they had more disease in their brain for the amount of cognitive impairment. So they had something that was protecting them, and the idea was it was this better brain to start with.
Yeah, interesting. It's
fascinating book.
That
was one of the ones I added to my list of recommendations.
Okay, well, we are there now.
Okay,
we're almost there. What 3 lessons would you say you want readers to take away from your book? What 3 key lessons would you say?
Well, I would say number 1 is to be proactive and to not just throw up your hands in denial. And this is the main thing I believe that is really slowing impacting the health of people is denial. And it's denial in families, and it's denial particularly in the patients often. And that certainly was almost 100% the case back in the 80s and 90s when I was getting started. And I make a point of talking about Alzheimer's to, probably to people who wish that I wouldn't. I'll chat with neighbors about it and things like that. I like people to think about it because everybody has a friend or a relative with dementia.
Yeah.
But they generally don't feel comfortable talking about it. So yeah, get out there and talk about it and think positively about the things that you could do to slow the progression of the disease. And that's where the lifestyle changes come in. And it's not voodoo. I'm not, touchy-feely guy, about
But well,
the latest thing in the magazine. So, this is real stuff. I mean, it really does make a difference.
I think that's a key. That's a strong lesson. We've touched a bit on the question of the uncertainties still in the field of Alzheimer's disease, kind of whether the drugs work or don't work. Is there any other kind of uncertainty that is still lingering regarding the science of Alzheimer's disease?
Well, this on the same subject is cost and availability as these drugs. That's something that people are finally talking about, at least in the U.S., where these drugs are becoming available.
Yeah.
But are they worth it? Are they worth it to our health system? For the small amount of thing? And what about the rest of the world? In South America, in Africa, what are they going to be able to get things if that we find that work? So that may not be the question you were asking, but there are a lot of issues in terms of equality and availability that really haven't been addressed.
It's a big issue really across the board. Yeah. And again, we've touched on the issue of the future for the field. You did mention the hope that some cure can come. What time frame would you give? I know you avoided answering that. In the next 30 years, do you think there'll be a cure?
Don't say that. That's a bad word. A bad word, cure.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't know. I mean, in 30 years, we'll certainly be doing better. And I don't know if there'll be a cure or not. I think in 5 years we'll have made progress.
So I think the emphasis is on care, isn't it? More on care.
But cure, bad word.
Okay, we've got another lesson of the book is don't talk about cure. And you mentioned your book, Dispatches from the Land of Alzheimer's, and how different is that from? Is that the thing you've just read out? A couple of are they kind of just like the passages you've read out?
They're essays. They're not. It's not a continual chapter. And honestly, most of those essays started out as posts on my blog, Tattoo on My Brain, and then most of them that were altered and expanded or whatever. A few of them are. There's one about process of nausea that I originally published in the Scientific American, and about face blindness, and at that time it was making the point that one of the similarities of COVID and Alzheimer's was face blindness, for totally different reasons.
Yeah.
So it's not a book that I would recommend as a Bible to learn how to do this, that, and the other thing. It's more something to dabble in. And I talk about some of the drugs that have failed, and the ones that have shown promise. And but it's not. I would recommend, if you were only going to read one of my books, to read Tattoo, because it really has more of a linear message to get out.
And just to say, I have reviewed the book on my Doctor's Bookshelf blog for those who want to have a taster of it. You also told me, I think, by email about some projects you've been involved in. I think one was it published in one of the papers in the UK? Is that, or did I get it wrong?
I'm sorry.
Was there a project, any other projects you've been involved in apart from writing books?
Oh yeah. Yeah, well, there was a documentary film. Is that
documentary?
Yeah, documentary film done in the U.S. Based on the book Tattoo on My Brain.
Okay.
and it's short. It's 32 minutes, and I think they did a good job. It was done by Paramount.
Okay.
The MTV department, which is MTV Documentaries, which is division of Paramount. It's available streaming, and I think it's available in the UK, but I'm not absolutely sure about that. You do have Paramount streaming in the UK, I think.
I'm still
Yeah,
old school. I'm not too much into
yeah,
stream,
me
but
neither.
I
Me neither.
will. Yeah, but it's piqued my curiosity. I will have a look at that. Okay.
But it turned out to be a relatively hopeful, not a depressing film.
Good. Good.
And it has footage of me getting PET scans and stuff down in San Francisco, and so that there's some things that are interesting that most people probably won't be getting, but at least they can see what it's like.
Okay. That's very positive. Um, um, my formulaic last question usually is what books you would recommend to listeners, viewers, and you did tell me you had a list of 30, but you whittled it down to 5.
Okay, I got it down to 5, right. So the David Snowden book I already mentioned.
Okay, what's the title?
The title is Aging with Grace.
Aging with Grace.
Yeah. There are two books that I picked out written by people with Alzheimer's that I think are really good. Okay. One is Wendy Mitchell's book, Somebody I Used to Know. Do you know about her? She's a Brit, and she worked for. She was an administrator in the National Health Service in England.
I've read the book. I've read her book. I actually want to quote it in one of the podcasts. So
okay, yes, all right. So I think I haven't read her second book, but the first one I thought was great. And in fact, I used part of that what she said as in one of my essays in the new book about working with Alzheimer's, because you may recall she went to her supervisors at the National Health Service wanting to have some things done to make it easier for her to manage her sector, and nobody knew what to do. And they said early retirement, and
she found a way around it, wasn't it?
Yeah. Anyway, okay. And the other one I like a lot from a patient point of view is Greg O'Brien's book on Pluto, Inside the Mind of Alzheimer's.
Okay.
And Greg is a retired well, I shouldn't say he's retired because he's still writing. He's a journalist who lives on Cape Cod, which is that little finger. It's where the first Americans landed in the United States, was on Cape Cod near Boston.
Okay.
And I've never met Greg, but we've talked on Zoom, and because he's a journalist, he's written quite eloquently about his disease and his family.
On Pluto.
Now, in terms of, yeah, and I don't know if it's available in the UK because I think it was self-published, but at least
I'm sure it will be. I will have a look.
Okay. Then there are a lot of books written by experts, and I picked one which I really liked the best, and that's Jason Karlawish, Karlawish, The Problem of Alzheimer's, and then it goes on for the title. But Jason is a geriatrician at University of Pennsylvania, who runs their Alzheimer's clinic, and this book is for the general reader. But it really talks, it gives a history of Alzheimer's, starting with Dr. Alzheimer, back in 1900 or something. And I found it to be fascinating, and I don't think it's too hard for the general public. So I would recommend it to you. I learned a lot, reading that book. And Jason's had me come and virtually and lecture to his public health class that he teaches, and that's been a great experience as well. And then finally, for fiction,
Okay.
Still Alice, which everyone should read that.
Okay.
Lisa Genova. That was her first book back in the
Was it
90s.
made into a movie recently? Was it?
Yeah.
Okay. I haven't.
Yeah.
Okay, that's
You
interesting.
know, I on an airplane, I started to watch the movie, and I had to stop because it was
Wow.
just too real. I
Okay.
mean,
Okay.
about that. But the book, you know, it's her. She's a neuroscientist, Lisa Genova,
Okay.
or she was. Now she's an author, but she's written. Her niche is fiction about people with neurological diseases,
That's the,
and she's probably the only person who that's a niche for her. I mean, she's written about, you know, ALS but the first one was still Alice, and it was based on her experiences with her grandmother who had Alzheimer's, and the heroine in the book is a 50-some-year-old professor at Harvard, a psychology professor who has early onset Alzheimer's, and it's so right on, but it's fiction. But
well, that's interesting. I've seen the pictures of the movie. I think it's Anthony
yeah,
Hopkins, I believe. Okay, that's interesting. I
yeah,
prefer books than films. I might go for the book.
yeah.
Uh, okay. Daniel Gibbs, thank you very much for participating in this episode of the Neurology Lounge podcast. It's been a pleasure having you, and I'm most grateful. Might get you back at some future time if the podcast carries on. Thank you very much.
Okay.
And to my audience, thank you so much for listening to the podcast and perhaps watching the vodcast, which will be on YouTube. If you found it enlightening, you may want to subscribe to NeuroChecklist, which is my neurology database, and perhaps catch up with my first book, Surfing the Brain, actually the second book, Surfing the Brain, a lot of interesting anecdotes about neurology. And why not subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or YouTube so that you don't miss the next episode of the Neurology Lounge podcast. Do join me then. Thank you very much. And Daniel Gibbs, perhaps we catch up at some time in the future. Thank you.
Great.